Hey, this is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. And the subject we're going to study today, the video I'm going to do, is a little bit different than any that I've really done yet. And it's the result of a bulletin article that I was writing for this coming Sunday's church bulletin. I don't know how familiar people are with the specifics of the language that surround the arrest, the beatings, and the trials of Jesus. A lot of times I think when we think of this particular subject, we go straight to the crucifixion and how brutal that was, and that's obviously a legitimate discussion to have and thing to study and know about, but it's really interesting to study what happened before, the hours between his betrayal in the garden after he had been praying, from that time until he was actually nailed to the cross. And so we're going to spend just a few minutes today looking at this idea. This is one thing I've done for many years, is I've always enjoyed studying words. And you look back over top of my head here, the first 4 shelves of my library behind me here are all language books, Greek and Hebrew books. This is something that I've always enjoyed studying. The richness of those languages, and sometimes the things that we miss in English, it's really interesting to study. There's so much that can be learned from looking at these words. And so that's what I want us to do for a few minutes today, is to talk about this language. And so what I'm going to do, it's not necessarily going to be chronological approach, looking at how things happened in a specific order, but it's going to be more looking at Matthew and Mark and Luke and John collectively, and just noticing some of the words that are used to describe what happened, again, between the time that he finished praying in the garden with his disciples until he is actually crucified. I don't know how often we, again, pay attention to these details, but we talk about Jesus being on trial. He actually, from his arrest until he was beaten by Pilate, according to John chapter 19, he was on 6 different trials. He went before Annas and Caiaphas. He went then to the Sanhedrin. After seeing the Sanhedrin, he went to Pilate. Then he went to Herod, and then he came back to Pilate. And then he was crucified. And this process took all night long. This was not a short, quickly done event. This took hours and hours. And some of the things that he went through during this period of time are really, I would say, when you read it and you understand the language, very emotional when you have a good grasp on exactly what took place. So I'm going to use a little bit of grammar, talk about some of the words that are used and the tense of these words and the voice, the things like this from the Greek language. But we're going to start in Matthew chapter 26 talking about this. We know that Judas betrayed Jesus. Judas, one of the 12. But the idea of him being alone is a false idea. He had many people that he was working with to accomplish this end, to accomplish the arrest of Jesus. And so we're starting in Matthew 26, and the first verse that I want to pay attention to is Matthew 26:47. It says, "And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude." Matthew records, and I've got just some notes written down here. All 3 writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, either they say a great multitude or a multitude with swords and clubs came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. So that's kind of a vague, we know this is a big group, a great multitude. But what's interesting is when you get to John's account, John uses a specific term that before I had studied this several years ago, it never really dawned on me what a great multitude was. What are we talking about here? So that's Matthew 26:47, Mark 14:43, and Luke 22 and verse 47. All, again, use this phrase multitude or great multitude. However, when you get to John's gospel, you look at John chapter 18, listen to what that says here beginning in verse 1. It says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, and he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Judas, having received," now I'm reading from the King James Version here, the New King James Version here, And it says this in John 18:3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops. The King James says a band, B-A-N-D. And then you go down a little bit further, John 18 and verse 12, it says, then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. Well, what are we talking about? So we have the great multitude, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John uses this word, a detachment of troops. This word is interesting when you look at it. It's actually a Roman term. We're reading the original, the New Testament was originally written in the Greek language, but this is a Roman term that's talking of, if it were that period of time, looking at that period of time, approximately 600 soldiers. So this is not a small event that's taking place here. There are hundreds of men who were involved in the arresting of Jesus. Now, it's not just Judas, and it's not just a couple of officers or Pharisees or Sadducees. It's 600 Roman soldiers who go with Judas to arrest Jesus. Well, what happens then, as you keep looking, so we have this, and Jesus had prophesied that this would happen. You know, Peter had made the claim, Lord, if necessary, I'll die with you. Here's your chance. Here's the mob to arrest Jesus. But each of these Gospels, Matthew and Mark, record that when this happened, it says in Matthew 26 and verse 56, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. They don't want any part of what's happening now. When they see what is taking place. Now, earlier in Matthew chapter 26, you look back up at verse 31, Jesus told them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. And that's when Peter said, even if all were made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. That's Matthew 26, verses 31 to 35. So in their mind, you know, they're convinced we're with you all the way, no matter what happens. Well, Matthew 26, 56, Mark 14, verse 50, all the disciples fled when Jesus was arrested. But again, that's not all that's involved here. What's going on in the background while this arrest in the garden is taking place, when Peter pulls out his sword and cuts off Malchus's right ear, as John records it for us, there are other things going on. The people who have arrested him or who are seeking to arrest him, Matthew records this in Matthew 26, 59. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. Matthew records that. Mark records that. Mark 14, verses 55 through 59. But it's interesting to look at that word sought in Matthew 26 and verse 59. And here's where some of the grammar comes in. Again, the Greek language I love to study it. There's so much to it. And sometimes when we're reading in the English, we can't pick up exactly what's being said, because it's hard sometimes to translate certain words from one language to another. And there are going to be several examples that I have for you here of that. So here in Matthew 26, 59, when it says they sought false testimony, this is what's written in the Greek language. It's called the imperfect. And what the imperfect tense is, it's a past tense, but it means it has continuous action. In other words, they didn't look to just one person for a false witness. They're constantly seeking after people who will lie about Jesus. So Matthew records that. Mark records that. And the interesting thing is, as they are seeking these false witnesses, Mark's account, let me see here, beginning in verse 55, listen how Mark records it. Mark 14, 55. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And then it says in verse 59, but even then did their testimony not agree. So you have these people who are willing to lie, and they can't even lie correctly. They're disagreeing. They're contradicting one another. But the chief priests, the Pharisees, these people who have invested themselves in killing Jesus, they don't care about that. All they care about is, okay, we have something against him. We've got him arrested with this detachment of troops, these 600 soldiers or so. Now let's find something to charge him with. So you have the arrest, you have the seeking out, people looking for things to basically justify what's being done here. But the next thing I want us to think about, to notice, and all four gospel writers mention this, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, about what happens after they arrest him in the process of his trials, these six different appearances that Jesus makes before different people. And I'm going to point some things out about the words that are used here. So they've arrested him. Matthew records Matthew 26, beginning in verse, let's see here. We'll start in verse 67. It says, "Then they spat in his face and beat him." If you were looking at a King James version, it doesn't say beat there, it says buffet. Well, the Greek word there means to strike with the fist. They're punching him. They're spitting on him, they're punching him, they're striking him with the palms of their hands. So not just a closed fist punch, but they're slapping him in the face. And the thing about these words that we miss in the English language is the tense that they're written in the Greek language. They're written in what's called the aorist tense of the Greek language, and the active voice. And what that means is, this is recording a past action that was ongoing. And so you could literally read this, "Then they were spitting in his face, and they were beating him, and they were slapping him with their hands." It wasn't just one or two people. This was that detachment of troops that have arrested him, constantly spitting, constantly punching, and constantly slapping him in the face. And again, that just shows you the richness of this language and what we miss sometimes, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Mark records it, Mark 14, beginning in verse 55. Talking about his arrest and his beating. Mark 14:65 says, "Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him." And again, it's expressing the same past tense but continuous action that was going on here as they were abusing him. Over in Luke's account, Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 63, "The men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him." And again, that's the imperfect tense. That's a past action with, it doesn't necessarily deal with how long it lasted, but it's just a past action that was ongoing. They're constantly mocking him and beating him and spitting on him. John also records it over in John chapter 18 and verse 22. One of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand. So there you have a slap in the face. You go to John chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. "Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they struck him with their hands." They kept on saying, they kept on striking. Again, this is that imperfect tense, active voice verb. It's a continuous action in the past. They were mocking him, spitting on him, beating him. And this, incidentally, looking here in John's account in John chapter 19, this is after Jesus has been scourged. He was beaten by these people before. Then Pilate had him scourged, which means whipped. And then the beating continues on after that. Another passage is Matthew chapter 27. I haven't looked at this one yet. Matthew 27. Verse 27 here talks about Jesus being gathered with the whole garrison. The New King James uses this term, the garrison. This whole detachment of troops have surrounded him. Verse 30 says they spat on him. Again, an aorist tense verb, past action. It has a duration to it. They're spitting on him. They took the reed out of his hand and were striking him on the head with it. And so pay attention to these terms. What's it matter? Somebody might be saying, well, that's, you're getting tied up in little details. Well, these are not little details. God gave us his word in human languages. Most of your Old Testament's written in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic. Your New Testament's written in Greek. And those languages are very, like I said earlier in the video, something that I enjoy studying, and you can see a lot more from the biblical text when you actually have a meaning of these words. When you think about what Jesus went through, it's so much more than just the crucifixion. Everything that went on before he was even crucified. And not only that, when he took his disciples to the garden to pray, the Bible tells us that he was For example, Matthew 26 and verse 37, he was very sorrowful and deeply distressed. All of this started, before his suffering started before his crucifixion. And certainly what he did on the cross was terrible and painful. But think about what he went through before he even was crucified, and all of the humiliation that he suffered, the physical abuse, the verbal abuse, and of course all of that as well continued on the cross. You can read those 4 accounts again, and you see once they have him nailed to the cross how they're mocking him, and the text will say something along the lines of, as the people walk by, they're wagging their heads at him. They're kind of treating him with disdain, and hey, you said you were this great Messiah. Well, then save yourself. A complete mockery of who he was and what he came here to do. So what does this matter? Well, he did this for us. One passage that comes to my mind is in John's Gospel, over in John chapter 10 and verses 17 and 18. Jesus says, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again." And then he says this in verse 18, "No man takes it from me. I lay it down of myself." And that should stress to us the depth of gratitude that we should have for what he did for us. He did it willingly. He knew what he was going to endure, what he was going to suffer, and he did it anyway. And I wonder sometimes if we, myself included here, if we really appreciate what he suffered when he went through, again, the arrest, the beatings, the trials, more beatings, and then the crucifixion. And as John is wrapping up his account here in John chapters 18 and 19, of course, they're wanting to get the bodies down off the cross because it's, the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is coming up. And so one of their practices was to ensure that a victim of crucifixion would die, is that they would break their legs, and this would ultimately cause the person to suffocate. Well, when they came to the body of Christ, they realized that he was already dead. And so John 19:34 says, "One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out." And I think that just shows the brutality of these people who were in charge of this crucifixion. He was already dead, and yet they still put a spear in his side just to ensure that death. And again, he did this willingly. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 to 18 talk about that. It says there that it behooved him to be made like to his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest. Well, that's who he is for us, but this is what he went through for us. And we need to appreciate it. And I think a good thing to do is to have study tools that can help you as you read the Bible to understand the language, understand the words that are being used and what they mean. The deepness and the richness of the language it's a benefit to you if you study those things in detail and not just have a casual reading or a casual familiarity with the events. Pay attention to the details, because this is what he did for us. So, like I said, this video is a little bit different today because I was writing an article for my bulletin. I started making some notes, and I thought I'd share my thoughts with you today. But I appreciate those of you who are on the live stream. And I will wrap this up. I will see you on the next video. Check out on Facebook, nearchurches.com, and the private group We Talk Truth. Ask to join that, and I or one of the other moderators will be happy to add you to that group. But anyway, thanks for tuning in today, and I'll see you on the next video.